privatization, it's licensing companies to run buses under their own colors. Tourist authorities don't like the new colors.
We're concerned that the red bus might disappear. It is a very potent symbol of London. If you ask any foreign visitor what they think about London, it's either the policeman, the black cab, or the red bus.
But, says the government, that's progress.
What I believe in is reasonable freedom for people in this life, and I'm not sure whether the state telling you what colour you can have the bus sounds very sensible in the last decade of the 20th century.
So what next? Buckingham Palace guardsmen in polka dots? Why not? In this world, bad ideas are like buses. If one misses you, there'll be another along in a minute.
Quite so. Now a brief check of tomorrow's national weather. Some rain for Melbourne and Hobart, showers developing in Perth, becoming fine in Adelaide, mainly fine in the other capital cities. ABC News to this minute. I'm Clive Hell. Thanks for watching the ABC's National Late Edition. We're back for you again tomorrow. Do have a good night.
Australia's national savings are at record lows. The answer, according to the Fitzgerald report released yesterday, is higher taxes and less spending. The government now has the excuse it's been looking for to put taxes up, not down.
It's really putting up a smokescreen for the government to be able to take some very nasty measures.
The reality is people will be asked to pay more. A taxing time. That's our story tonight.
Live from Sydney, the ABC's Lateline. Here's Maxine McHugh.
Welcome to the program. Last year, Paul Keating told us that we could have our cake and eat it too. In the One Nation statement, Keating offered $8 billion in tax cuts. And not only would he put more money in our pockets, he'd bring the budget back to surplus within 4 years. Well, ever since then, the government has been doing some furious backsliding. First, we were told that some new taxes might be needed after all. And as for the promised surplus, well, that might take a little longer than expected. Somehow, Paul Keating managed to keep up the pretense in the last election that tax cuts were still affordable. If he needed any convincing otherwise, it came yesterday with the release of the Fitzgerald report on savings. Fitzgerald told the government precisely what it expected to hear, that not only were the tax cuts going to be tough to pay for, we might need some new taxes as well. A bitter pill to solve one of Australia's chronic problems, a lack of savings. In a moment, we talk to Dr. Fitzgerald and two leading tax analysts. But first, this background report from Murray McLaughlin.
So, Vince, can I have it?
Treasurer, my report to you on national saving.
Ostensibly, it was all about national saving. But the report to the Treasurer of economist Vince Fitzgerald was as much a political document as it was a call for governments and the private sector to spend less and save more.
He's really putting up a smokescreen for the government to be able to take some very nasty measures to renege on a lot of its election promises and to change its policies.
But I find it very puzzling. At a time when we want the economy to revive, the suggestion is we should pay more taxes, pull money out of business, and pull money out of people's purchasing power. So I just think that it's the wrong solution at the wrong time.
Not since World War II, says Dr. Fitzgerald, has Australia's national saving been so low. And the troughs before then were the Depression and World War I. Saving is at 16% of gross domestic product, and Dr. Fitzgerald wants us all to lift that heftily. But for the Labor government of Paul Keating to accept Fitzgerald carte blanche would likely provoke a call to arms.
Higher taxes is obviously difficult for any government. Requiring additional contributions to superannuation is not something that people are going to celebrate about. And I think that's the problem. We've managed to get into a situation where there's no solution that's easy, and for that matter, there's no solution that's short-term. Basically, we have to look to a long-term solution to our problems.
Suggestions of higher taxes rankle, of course, with organisations like the Taxpayers Association, even if its national director accepts that the country does have a saving problem.
I accept and identify that Australia has a lower level of savings. I'm the first to hammer, as I have so many times, that Australia saves its money, Australians save their money in different ways. In many countries, people live in apartments. In Australia, people save money into their houses, into superannuation, and to a lesser extent these days into life assurance. And I believe Australians, considering their level of income and their level of potential saving, are very good and loyal savers. But what we need first is an industrial recovery, an economic recovery, so the people have the money in their pockets so they can save.
Paying off the family home may be looked at as a form of saving by Eric Ristrom. But Dr Fitzgerald's report criticises the diversion of superannuation funds into housing. It's in this approach, says Professor Tom Valentine, that Fitzgerald is at his most courageous.
The report points out there are some very significant biases in the Australian financial system towards investment in housing rather than investment in productive assets. Housing isn't a productive asset in the sense that it doesn't produce exports or import competing goods. It doesn't add to the competitiveness of our workers, and to the extent that savings are flowing into housing, it's not a desirable outcome. Dr Fitzgerald has suggested that the system be changed so that that bias towards housing is diminished.
It's a sin to tell a lie.
The ageing of Australia's population weighs on Fitzgerald's findings. Retirement saving, he said, needs to be stepped up. He suggests superannuation guarantee contributions around 18% of earnings would make most Australians independent of the age pension. But that trend, says Canberra economist and superannuation expert Darryl Dixon, would beg other questions.
Well, it seems that Dr Fitzgerald and the government are thinking that superannuation is the be-all and end-all. It will be the saviour of Australia. The facts are that it's quite different to that. Superannuation can't address the problems very quickly. It will take a long time for the money to build up to substantial amounts, even if you accelerate it, as Dr Fitzgerald was raising as one of his options. The other major trouble is it's a very expensive mechanism. That industry already has about $3 billion of fees and charges annually. There's lots of rip-offs of consumers. There's lots of high administrative charges, and Dr Fitzgerald has ignored the very important issue of making superannuation as effective as he appears to want governments to be. For example, he was talking about efficiency gains in the hospitals and those sort of sectors of the economy. I would have thought that the government should be first making superannuation efficient, especially if it's going to pump large amounts of money into it.
The release of the Fitzgerald report, only days before next week's Premier's conference, is timely, of course, for John Dawkins, given the Treasurer's urgings already that the states cut their spendings in education and health by $3 billion. The state premiers may be forced to buckle under, but the government will find the people much less inclined to accepting those recommendations of the Fitzgerald report which touch their pockets.
I very much doubt that it's likely to be endorsed by Mr Dawkins or Mr Keating tomorrow. It's really politically hot, there's no doubt about that. Very few politicians would like to come out and support the sorts of policies that have been suggested, except maybe the increase in compulsory superannuation, because it seems to be far enough away that maybe you can get away with it. I would hope that continued discussion within the community would lead to a recognition of the need to make these changes, and that then politicians would be in a position to introduce them.
That report from Murray McLaughlin. Now let me introduce our guests. Dr Vince Fitzgerald is the Executive Director of the Allen Consulting Group and the author of National Saving, a report to the Treasurer, released yesterday. He was Secretary of the Departments of Employment, Education and Training from 1987 to 89 and in Trade from 86 to 87. He previously worked as a Senior Advisor in the Departments of Finance, Prime Minister and Cabinet and Treasury. He joins us from our Canberra studio. Professor Julian Disney is the Director of the Australian National University's Centre for International and Public Law. He has an advisory role on EPAC as well as on John Dawkins' Superannuation Consultative Committee. Professor Disney is also in Canberra. Geoffrey Lehman is a partner in business and accounting advisors Pricewaterhouse. Until 1988, he was a senior lecturer in commercial law at the University of New South Wales and is the co-author of a textbook, Taxation Law in Australia. He's in our Sydney studio. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Good evening.
Julian Disney, if I could start with you, is Dr Fitzgerald's report a bit of a surprise to you in terms of the language used and the options raised?
Well, it's a pleasant surprise. I think there are a lot of good things in it, and I think it's got a degree of rigour and clarity and generally fair-mindedness, which hasn't always been a hallmark of some of the official papers in this area in recent years. I think it gets away from some of the simplistic ideologies that have bedevilled proper analysis of the need for public revenue and of problems, for example, in the new superannuation system. I think a particularly important thing is that he emphasises repeatedly the primacy of restoring our public revenue, which is already at a 20-year low and will get lower. And I think he makes some good recommendations, or canvasses some good options, I should say, for addressing that. I think also in relation to expenditure, he emphasises that improving public sector efficiency should be the main goal rather than just an obsessive cutting of expenditure for its own sake, and indeed recognises there's a need for more spending in areas like infrastructure and labour market programs. And I think, although perhaps more emphasis could have been placed on this, he recognises a number of the significant weaknesses in the new compulsory superannuation system. He has perhaps a bit more faith in expanding it than I do, but he emphasises we must get the essentials right, that they're not right at the moment and they must be corrected quickly. And I think the last of the major good things in it is that it recognises that the regime, the tax regime that applies to other kinds of savings is bad. It's too favourable towards housing for the reasons Professor Valentine mentioned, and it's too unfavourable towards savings for purposes like parenting or possible unemployment. But the big limitation, I think, is that it's too sanguine about extending the superannuation system. And I think, and perhaps we can discuss this more later, that
I was just going to say,
greater emphasis on a job development levy would have been useful.
All right, we can come back to some of those points. Dr. Fitzgerald, was that one of the factors driving you, though, an attempt to get away from the orthodoxy of the 80s?
I'm not sure I understand the drift of your question,
Well,
Maxine.
I mean, for instance, it wasn't so long ago there that we had the Treasurer talking about spend, 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 and now you're putting quite a different twist on all of this, obviously.
Well, I have to say I share the concern of many economists that the recovery be maintained, and with regard to Eric Bristrom's earlier comments in particular, there's very careful language in the report emphasising that right now in 1993 and in the short to medium term, there's no sensible course that involves radical tightening of fiscal policy, either by cutting expenditure or by raising taxes. I think that fiscal policy is appropriately stimulatory now to maintain the recovery and have employment hopefully begin to grow enough to bring unemployment down consistently. So what we're really talking about is not the very short term, but the task of making sure that the growth we get is maintained over the mid and late 90s, so that as unemployment continues to as unemployment comes down, it continues to come down throughout the whole of the decade. And that's where the saving issue, and in particular the strengthening of the public fiscal position, is important in that medium to longer term context.
Jeff Lehman, you've had a chance to have a good look at Dr. Fitzgerald's report. Do you think he's got the emphasis about right?
Yes, I'm very impressed by the Fitzgerald report. I think there are several things that underlie this report. Perhaps they're more implicit than actually spelt out in the report. But I think that one of the things that's happened over the last 40 or 50 years is that Western economies have perhaps headed down the wrong route. We have believed that levying taxes from the present generation and then paying them to people who are older is somehow going to work, and that people can rely on social security in their old age and when they're unemployed, rather than trying to contribute something to a system which they can identify. So that I think that raising the superannuation guarantee levy to 18% of salary personal exertion income, while it's still less than what is happening in Singapore, where it's 30% effectively overall, nevertheless is a recognition of the fact that people, when they pay tax, prefer to have something that they're paying towards their own future rather than something that is going into some general pool which a large number of people can ravage and take advantage of. So I think that's one aspect of the Fitzgerald report. The other aspect, I think, is that our debt levels are rising to a very high level, and that this will increase the interest rates that Australia has to pay to overseas lenders when we wish to invest. And perhaps superannuation and other forms of saving which are suggested are the way of getting away from that. We have to invest ourselves in our own future, and we can't expect continually to rely on great and powerful friends, which has been the tendency of Australia over the last 30 or 40 years.
Would you point to anything that you feel Dr. Fitzgerald has left out of his report?
Well, he has emphasised the fact that state governments can increase their efficiency, but as was recently pointed out by Des Moore, the federal government itself from 1989-90 to 1992-93 has increased Commonwealth public sector employment by 7.8% at a time when the economy has grown only by 2%, and one wonders what, if any, extra productivity all of those extra public servants are producing for the country.
So there could have been extra expenditure cuts?
Well, I think so, yes. It's hard to see how you can justify increasing the number of public servants, federal public servants, by 7.8% when the economy itself has only grown by 2%. So I think that while it's implicit that the federal government has to have spending cuts, that's implicit in the Fitzgerald report, he tends to only refer to the state government sector.
Dr. Fitzgerald, on that point?
Well, it's a fair point. The fact is, though, that the Commonwealth does not run very many large-scale service delivery programs. One of the few is the area of labour market programs in my old department, DEET, which of course has had to expand greatly in the course of the recession. I think that in the course of expanding those labour market programs, undoubtedly there have been some inefficiencies. Certainly employment in that area of government in the Commonwealth sector has risen, but the fact is that at the Commonwealth level, efficiency gains will only get you pretty modest dividends in the form of expenditure savings, and